She told him the lobby wasn't for loitering. She said it with the particular confidence of someone who has never once been wrong about anything, who has never had to be, whose entire professional self has been constructed on the certainty that she reads a room correctly on the first pass and adjusts accordingly. She gestured toward the revolving door with a manicured hand and informed a quiet man in worn traveling clothes that guests of the Alderton were expected to maintain a certain standard. She used that word, standard, with the weight of someone who considers it the highest word in the language, and that she would be happy to call him a car to somewhere more suitable. The quiet man looked at her for a moment, not with anger, not with the wounded dignity of someone who has just understood they are being insulted. He looked at her the way a person looks at something they are filing away for later consideration. Then he thanked her politely, picked up his leather satchel from the floor beside the chair, wrapped his scarf a little tighter against what was waiting for him outside, and walked back out through the revolving door into the February wind off Lake Michigan. His name was Marcus Alderton. He owned every square foot of the building she was standing in. He owned the chairs she had asked him to vacate. He owned the marble floors beneath her feet, the soft-lit reception desk at the far end of the lobby, the restaurant on the ground floor, the rooftop bar above, and every room stacked between them. He had owned all of it for 22 years, and he had built most of what it had become with a stubbornness that people who knew him well described as his defining characteristic, and people who didn't know him well sometimes mistook for passivity. He had walked in through that revolving door the same way he always did, without announcement, without an escort, without the theater of arrival. And he had walked back out through it the same way, thanking a woman who had just asked him to leave his own building, because that was who Marcus Alderton was. And that fact was about to become very, very relevant. Before we go any further into this story, if you've ever been dismissed by someone who had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with, someone who looked at you, saw only the surface, made their judgment in the first 3 seconds, and missed everything underneath, this one is for you. Hit that like button right now, because what happens next is exactly the kind of thing that reminds you why patience is not the same thing as weakness. If you're new here, subscribe and stay with us, because we bring you stories like this every single week, and we mean it when we say they hit differently. Drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Now let's go back to where this really begins. Marcus Alderton was 53 years old, and he had spent the better part of his adult life building things that other people eventually took for granted, which was, he had always believed, the highest compliment a built thing could receive. If something was so well made, so well maintained, so exactly what it was supposed to be, that people stopped noticing it and simply relied on it, then the work had been done right. That was his philosophy. That was the standard he held his properties to, and more quietly himself. The Alderton Chicago was his first hotel. Not the first he'd ever owned. He had 11 properties at this point, scattered across 6 states, ranging from a 50-room boutique inn in Savannah to a 220-room full-service hotel in Denver that had required 4 years and a refinancing to get right. But the Alderton Chicago was the first. The one that had started as a bankrupt 30-room bed and breakfast on the frayed edge of River North, purchased in the spring of 2003 with a bank loan co-signed by his late mother, and every dollar Marcus had managed to save over 8 years of working his way up through hospitality management, from front desk clerk to operations supervisor to assistant, general manager, absorbing everything he could from every property he touched, learning not just how hotels ran, but why the good ones ran the way they did, and why the others slowly fell apart. He had refinished the floors of that original building himself, on his knees with a rented sander over a long weekend, because the contractor quote had come back 40% over what he could afford, and he had done the math and decided his own time was the cheaper resource. He had negotiated with linen suppliers over the phone from a folding table set up in what would eventually become the concierge suite. He had run the front desk himself for the first 3 months because he couldn't yet afford to staff it properly, and he refused, on principle, to open a hotel he couldn't run well. He had stayed up for 36 hours straight in the week before the grand opening fixing a plumbing situation that the contractor had, without notice or apology, simply abandoned. He had cried once alone in the building at 2 in the morning during that first year, when the financing had gotten precarious enough that he genuinely considered whether to cut his losses and sell. He had decided, in that same quiet 2 in the morning, that he was not going to do that. He had decided, and then he had gone back to work, and the crisis had resolved, as crises generally do, for people who refuse to treat them as permanent. That was 22 years ago. The Alderton Chicago was now a 140-room boutique luxury hotel with a Michelin-recognized restaurant on the ground floor, a rooftop bar that had been featured in 3 national travel publications in the past year alone, and a waiting list for weekend dinner reservations that stretched nearly 2 months. The building had been expanded twice, renovated fully once, and was in Marcus's estimation currently the best it had ever been, not just in terms of aesthetics or revenue, though both were strong, but in terms of the thing that was harder to quantify and more important than either: the feeling the place gave you when you walked in. The warmth of it, the sense that the space itself was glad you were there. He did not, however, feel any particular need to announce any of this to the world. He never had. It was, in some ways, the quality that had most frustrated his first business partner, who had believed that ownership required a certain visible performance of ownership, and most endeared him to his staff, who had learned over years that the man who showed up unannounced and walked the kitchen was not there to catch them doing something wrong. He was there because he genuinely wanted to know how things were going. There is a significant difference between those two intentions, and the people who work in a building can always feel it. Marcus showed up. That was his signature. He showed up at his properties without warning. He walked through the lobbies and the kitchens and the laundry facilities in the basement. He talked to the housekeeping staff about what they needed, and to the line cooks about what was working, and to the parking attendants about what the guests were saying on the way out. He carried no briefcase embossed with his initials. He wore no suit chosen to telegraph his authority. He traveled the way a man travels when the destination matters more than the impression he makes upon arrival. Efficiently, practically, in clothes chosen for a long flight in a middle seat rather than for the theater of a lobby entrance. This particular Tuesday in February, he had flown in from Phoenix, where his newest property, a boutique hotel in a renovated warehouse district building, was in the final stages of a renovation that had been plagued by weather delays, a subcontractor who had walked off the job in November, and a dispute with the general contractor over change order costs that had required the kind of careful, document-intensive negotiation that aged a person visibly. Marcus had handled it. He had handled it the way he handled everything, methodically, without drama, with the underlying conviction that every problem has a resolution if you're willing to sit with it long enough and read every piece of paper carefully enough. He had also, during those same 6 weeks, managed 2 board calls, a lease renegotiation on a property in Nashville, and a meeting with a construction lender that had required the specific form of sustained, patient diplomacy that leaves a person wrung out in a way that ordinary exhaustion doesn't quite capture. He had landed at O'Hare at 4 in the afternoon. His coat was not heavy enough for the wind that came at him outside the terminal, a fact he registered and made a mental note to address before this trip was over. He had taken a car directly to the Alderton Chicago because he had a dinner meeting with his general manager at 7, and he wanted to walk the property first. He wanted to see it with fresh eyes, or as close to fresh eyes as a person can manage on a building they've known for 2 decades. He had not wanted to stop anywhere to change clothes or pick up anything more official looking. He had simply wanted to come through the door the way he always did. What he had not fully accounted for was that the Alderton Chicago had In the 6 weeks he'd been submerged in Phoenix, acquired a new front-of-house manager. Her name was Claudia Voss. She had been recruited from the Meridian on Walker, a competitor property where she had spent 4 years building a reputation for operational precision and an approach to guest experience that her references described consistently as exceptional. Marcus's general manager, a man named Daniel Park, had sent Marcus a brief email about the hire in early January, a note that said her references were strong. Her process improvements at the Meridian had measurably improved guest satisfaction scores, and he was confident she was the right fit for a role that had been unfilled for longer than was comfortable. Marcus had read the email, trusted Daniel's judgment, as he always did, and moved on to the 17 other things requiring his attention. He had made a mental note to meet her properly during his next Chicago visit. He had not, in the sustained emergency of the Phoenix situation, found time to review her file in any detail. He had not reviewed the photograph in her personnel record. He had not arranged a formal introduction. He had assumed, in the way that a person assumes things when they are very busy and they trust their people, that things would sort themselves out when the time came. He was correct about this in the end, though the sorting took an unexpected form. Claudia Voss was 38 years old and possessed of the posture and the precise diction of someone who had decided, quite early, that presentation was the primary currency of professional life, and that every detail of her own presentation was therefore worth deliberate attention. She had been in her role at the Alderton, Chicago, for exactly 5 weeks. In those 5 weeks, she had already reorganized the front desk staffing rotation to reduce wait times during peak check-in hours, redesigned the luggage handling flow so that bags arrived in rooms faster than the previous standard, and implemented what she called in the documentation she had prepared for Daniel an elevated guest threshold standard for the lobby. A phrase that, translated from its polished packaging, meant that the lobby was for hotel guests and approved visitors, and that anyone who appeared not to meet the visual requirements of those categories was to be approached promptly, politely, and redirected. She had arrived at this policy through a combination of professional instinct and institutional context. In her onboarding, Daniel had mentioned a situation from the previous autumn, a non-guest who had occupied the lobby seating area for several hours and eventually created a scene that had visibly upset a number of paying guests and required the involvement of hotel security. Claudia had heard this and taken it seriously. She had looked at the lobby's layout, its seating arrangement, its sight lines from the reception desk, and she had designed a response that she believed was both professional and proportionate. She was not wrong about the problem she was solving. She was wrong about something else entirely, and she had not yet discovered what. Marcus came through the revolving door at 10 minutes past 4. He stood for a moment inside the warmth of the lobby, the way he always did on these arrivals, not performing anything, not waiting for anything, simply reacquainting himself with the space, letting his attention move the way a craftsman's attention moves over something he built, settling on this detail and then the next. The large flower arrangement at the center table was slightly overcrowded. Someone had been generous with the stems, and the proportions were slightly off from what he specified. The lighting above the reception desk was fractionally warmer than his last directive. Someone had swapped a bulb or adjusted a dimmer, and the effect was not bad, actually. He'd need to decide whether to formalize the change. The marble floors were immaculate, catching the late afternoon light from the street-facing windows in exactly the way he'd always intended. The sound system was running the right playlist at the right volume. A family was checking in at the far desk. The agent was smiling, leaning slightly forward, the posture of genuine attention rather than performance. These details told Marcus more in 5 minutes than any occupancy report. He moved toward the cluster of chairs near the window, the seating area he often used during these informal walkthroughs, where the angle gave him a good view of the lobby circulation, and the light at this hour was particularly warm. He set his satchel on the floor beside the chair. He unwound his scarf. He had just settled in when he heard the approach. "Excuse me," he looked up. Claudia Voss was crossing the lobby toward him with the particular stride of a person who has identified an issue and is entirely confident in their assessment of it. The stride of competence that has not yet encountered the information that would complicate it. "I'm sorry, sir, but this seating area is reserved for hotel guests." She stopped before him. Her smile was the specific temperature of professionally administered courtesy, warm on the surface, clear beneath it about its actual purpose. "Are you a registered guest with us this evening?" Marcus looked at her for a moment. "I'm just going to sit for a few minutes," he said. "I understand, but our lobby policy—" "I won't be long." His voice was even unhurried. The voice of a man who has no particular reason to be anything other than exactly what he is. Something in her expression adjusted, almost imperceptibly. In her professional experience, that tone, that specific, unruffled quality, the voice that doesn't rise to meet the implied challenge, was sometimes the prelude to a difficult interaction. She had dealt with men who believed their apparent self-assurance entitled them to spaces they had no claim to. She had managed those situations precisely, and she was prepared to manage this one. "Sir," she said. And now the warmth had been cleanly set aside in favor of something more efficient. "I've already asked you politely. The lobby seating is for registered guests of the Alderton. If you're not currently checked in, I do need to ask you to move on. I'm happy to direct you to a very good cafe just up the block, or if you have somewhere you need to be, I can arrange a car. There are several options I'd be glad to help you with, but I'm not in a position to allow—" "You're Claudia Voss," Marcus said. She stopped. Her expression shifted, something recalibrating in the slight rearrangement of her features, though she had not yet identified what the recalibration was in response to. "That's right. Daniel hired you out of the Meridian on Wacker." About 6 weeks ago, he said this with no emphasis, no particular weight, as one states a straightforward fact. Her posture changed almost imperceptibly. Something that might on another face have looked like the first edge of concern arrived somewhere behind her eyes. "That's correct. I'm sorry. Have we met before?" "Not formally." He stood. He extended his hand. "Marcus Alderton." The lobby in that moment did what lobbies do. It continued. The check-in desk hummed with the quiet activity of early evening arrivals. A couple crossed toward the elevator bank, pulling matching luggage. The sound system moved seamlessly from one track to the next. The city outside the glass continued its gray February business. None of it paused. None of it marked what had just happened in the seating area near the window, which was the moment the floor fell out from under Claudia Voss's afternoon. She had read that name. She had read it in her employment contract. She had read it in the hotel documentation Daniel had walked her through during her first week. The organizational chart, the mission statement, the framed history of the property on the wall just outside the restaurant entrance. Alderton. Alderton, Chicago. Alderton Hospitality Group. The man who had bought a struggling bed and breakfast in River North 22 years ago with a co-signed loan and turned it into the flagship of an 11-property portfolio. She had read all of that. She had simply never seen a photograph. She had connected to a face, never been given the context that would allow her to match the name to the man. And so, when a quietly dressed person in a well-worn coat came through the revolving door and sat down in the lobby seating area with a leather satchel and an unremarkable traveling scarf, she had done exactly what her training and her policy told her to do. She had resolved the situation efficiently. She had resolved Marcus Alderton efficiently. She had directed him toward a cafe up the block. She had offered to call him a car. Her hand completed the handshake on a kind of autopilot that was entirely separate from the rest of her cognitive functions, which appeared to be in a complete and catastrophic hold pattern. "It's good to meet you," Marcus said. He picked up his satchel. "I have some time before Daniel arrives. Do you mind if I sit here?" He asked it without irony, without the sharp edge that the moment could have justified, that most people in his position would have wielded without a second thought. He asked it the way he'd ask anyone, the way a man asks, when the outcome genuinely doesn't matter that much, when he's already decided that what's needed here is something more productive than the obvious response. And that, Claudia Voss would reflect later, with considerable discomfort and a strange, reluctant admiration, was somehow the most difficult part, not the embarrassment. The witnessing. She excused herself from the lobby approximately 40 seconds later. Not quickly enough to be called fleeing, but not slowly enough to be called something else. Marcus settled into the chair by the window and spent the next 20 minutes doing what he had come to do. He watched his lobby run. He watched the rhythm of it, the way a property's soul shows itself in its ordinary moments, in the way the desk agent turned to find a pen and found it in the same place it had always been, in the way the bellman moved luggage without being asked, "Will?" London, in the way a guest coming out of the elevator and looking slightly uncertain about which direction led to the restaurant was met with a quiet pointing gesture before she had to stop and ask. These were the small, unremarkable things that excellent hotels were made of. They were happening here. They had been happening here, he suspected. For most of the time he'd been in Phoenix, because Daniel ran a good operation and had hired good people, and because the culture of a place, when it's been built properly, continues in the builder's absence. He allowed himself the private satisfaction of that. He had always taken his satisfactions quietly, in the same proportion he took everything else. At 4:35, Daniel Park came through the door from the back corridor and crossed the lobby with the expression of a man who has very recently been told something that has complicated his afternoon significantly and is now managing the weight of that information while trying to present a professional surface. He was not entirely succeeding, but the attempt was genuine, and Marcus found that sufficient. Marcus. His handshake was firm, his eye contact direct. 5 years of working together had established a shorthand of mutual respect between them that neither of them ever saw any need to elaborate on. "I just heard. I should have made the introduction before today. That's on me." "Sit down," Marcus said. They sat. Marcus asked about the occupancy pattern over the last 2 months, about the kitchen situation, a line cook shortage that had been mentioned in the January report, about the intermittent heating complaints from the 4th floor that had been in the maintenance log since November. Daniel answered all of it with the focused precision of someone who knows his numbers and doesn't need to pad them to make himself look better than the reality. These were the conversations Marcus valued above almost any other professional experience. Practical, honest, held by people who understood that the truth, even when it was inconvenient, was always better raw material than the polished version. "She's good," Marcus said. There was a brief pause. "Claudia?" Daniel looked at him carefully. "The check-in flow is measurably better than my last visit. The lobby positioning is improved. The staff are using their space more effectively. The desk rotation is tighter." He paused. She applied a policy she'd been given real reasons to apply, and she applied it to the wrong person. But the judgment behind the policy is sound. The policy itself is not the problem. Daniel, who had spent the better part of 40 minutes in his office carefully constructing an approach to a conversation he had expected to be significantly more consequential, was quiet for a moment. "I'll have a conversation with her tonight about—" "I'll speak with her," Marcus said. "Invite her to join us at dinner." Daniel went to deliver this invitation with the expression of a man who has just been told to defuse a device that turned out not to be a device at all, and who is still processing the gap between what he'd braced for and what is actually being asked of him. Claudia Voss, for her part, spent the 47 minutes between the lobby and the dinner in a state that was the controlled internal equivalent of a very thorough disaster. She had replayed the exchange with the particular cruelty of a mind that knows exactly where the decision went wrong and returns to that point on a compulsive loop, examining it from every angle, finding nothing that makes it better. She had, in the lobby, done 3 things in rapid succession. When she'd returned to the back office, she had shut the door, she had taken a controlled breath, and she had Googled Marcus Alderton on her phone. The photographs had come up immediately. She had looked at them with the focused attention of someone hoping to find a discrepancy, some difference between the man in the lobby and the man in the search results. That would create even a small amount of distance between what had happened. There was no discrepancy, same quiet eyes, same unremarkable presence, the complete absence of the visual signals she had been trained to read as indicators of the kind of person who belonged in a space like the Alderton. That absence, she now understood, was not accidental. It was a choice. It was, in fact, the whole point. She dressed for the dinner with the efficiency of someone who is filling every available second with purposeful action to prevent the alternative. She chose her clothes carefully, not for performance, but because care was the only form of respect available to her in this moment, and she intended to bring everything she had. The restaurant on the ground floor of the Alderton, Chicago, was called Linden. It had 28 tables, a menu that changed every 6 weeks in response to seasonal availability, and a kitchen run by Chef Priya Vasquez, who had spent 8 years working in restaurants in New York and Barcelona before Marcus had made a case, patient, specific, free of the flattery that high-performing chefs had learned to discount, that what she actually wanted was to run her own room without the noise and the politics and the constant churn of a larger operation. Priya had been skeptical. She had told Marcus she'd think about it for a week and then called him back in 4 days, which he'd taken as a good sign. She now had a Michelin recognition and had declined, in the 2 years since, 3 separate offers from other properties. Marcus had known she would stay. He was generally, he had found, a reliable reader of what people need in order to become what they are already capable of being. Claudia arrived at the table at 7, punctual to the minute. Daniel was already seated. The table was set for 3, near the window at the far end of the restaurant where the light was warmest and the street noise was least. She sat. She thanked the server for the water. She folded her napkin in her lap with the composure of a person who has decided that composure is the only thing currently standing between her and a much harder evening. "I owe you an apology," she said. She looked at Marcus directly because she had decided during those 47 minutes that directness was the only thing she had that was worth bringing to this table, and she intended to lead with it fully. What happened in the lobby this afternoon was a mistake I will not repeat. I made an assumption I had no grounds for making, and I acted on it in a way that was, she chose the word slowly, giving it the weight it required, disrespectful. That's not a reflection of the standard I hold for this property. It's not a reflection of the standard I hold for myself. Marcus picked up the menu. "The scallop preparation," he said to Daniel, with the focused attention of a person who has genuinely moved on. "Priya changed something since last month." Daniel blinked. He looked at the menu. "The citrus element. I think she mentioned it in the... It's more interesting now." He looked at Claudia. "I accepted your apology the moment you offered it. Now tell me about your first 5 weeks." She looked at him across the table for a moment in which several things she had prepared, the additional acknowledgments, the careful framings, the various forms of the apology she'd been rehearsing since the lobby, became immediately unnecessary. She set them aside. She began to talk about her work. What followed was a dinner that Claudia Voss would describe to herself afterward as the most disorienting professional experience of her life, and not in the way she had steeled herself for. There was no formal reckoning. There was no careful management of the lobby incident designed to establish the hierarchy of what had occurred and what would now be done about it. There was no performance of magnanimity whose actual function was to make her feel smaller by contrast to the largeness of the forgiveness being extended. Marcus Alderton asked her about her work with the specific, knowledgeable engagement of someone who understood exactly what she was doing and was genuinely interested in why she was doing it that way. He asked about the check-in flow changes, the specific decisions, the data she'd used, the staff resistance she'd encountered, and how she'd worked through it. He asked about the lobby policy, how she'd communicated it, how she'd trained for it, what metrics she was using to assess its effectiveness. He asked about the afternoon, once, directly, and only to understand the information that had led to her assessment. Not to examine the mistake as a wound, not to establish the record of it, but to understand it as a system failure so that the system could be improved. The policy isn't the problem, he said. He had set down his fork. His voice was the same as it had been in the lobby, even, unhurried, carrying the weight of what it was saying without any additional performance. The policy is a reasonable response to a situation that actually happened. The gap is context. You applied a judgment you'd been trained to make in an environment where it made sense to make it. At most of the properties you've worked in, the ownership is either absent or announced. I'm not that owner. I walk in through the front door the same way everyone else does. I sit in the same seating. I use the same space. That's not an accident. It's how I learn what I need to know about how a property is actually functioning, as opposed to how it functions when people know they're being observed. Which means anyone responsible for first contact needs to know that someone who looks like they could be anyone might be exactly that. That's not a training problem you created. That's a briefing failure in your onboarding. And that failure belongs to Daniel and to me. Daniel, whose professional dignity was fully intact despite this, nodded once in the manner of a person accepting a fair assessment. We fix all three gaps, Marcus said. The policy briefing, the recognition protocol, and the onboarding documentation. We fix them, starting now, and we make sure they're reflected across every property in the portfolio, because if this gap exists in Chicago after 5 weeks, it exists in Denver and Nashville and Savannah and everywhere else. He raised his glass. Thank you for an honest apology. That matters more than most people understand. After a moment that lasted precisely as long as it needed to, Claudia raised her glass. Daniel quietly raised his. The dinner continued. It moved into the easy, direct rhythm of 3 people who are actually working on something together, which is a different quality of conversation than 3 people performing for each other across a table. The scallops arrived, and they were exactly what Marcus had said. More interesting, a brightness in the composition that hadn't been there last month. Priya came out at the end of the main course, as she occasionally did on evenings when she knew Marcus was in the building, and Marcus told her the citrus adjustment was exactly right. Priya looked pleased in the way that people look pleased when the person whose opinion they actually value notices the thing they quietly changed. Claudia watched this exchange and understood something she had not fully understood before. She was looking at a man who had built 11 hotels, had built the room she was sitting in, had specified its light and its proportions and the temperature of its warmth, not through the application of capital and authority, though he had both, but through the patient accumulation of exactly these moments. The noticed adjustment, the honest dinner, the apology received and immediately set aside in favor of the next thing. She was looking at the kind of hospitality she had read about in professional development materials and had admired as a concept, without ever quite encountering it lived. The kind that moves through an organization from the top down, because the person at the top actually practices it, not as a brand position, not as a value statement on a website, but as a genuine daily habit of being present to the work and to the people doing it. She thought about the lobby. She thought about the revolving door and the cold air coming through it, and the quiet man in the inadequate coat who had thanked her politely. Before leaving, he had thanked her. After she had effectively asked him to leave a building he had purchased with his own money, built with his own decisions, and held for 22 years. He had picked up his bag, rewrapped his scarf, and said thank you, and walked back out into a Chicago winter without a single word of what she now knew he could have said, without any of the corrective that the moment had fully entitled him to. That was not weakness. She was certain of that now. That was something that operated at a register entirely above what she was accustomed to recognizing as strength. The following morning, Claudia arrived at the Alderton, Chicago at 7 o'clock. Her shift began at 7:40. She used the 40 minutes before it to write a document that she then took directly to Daniel's office and placed on his desk, asking for 15 minutes between his morning briefings to discuss it. The document was a proposal for a revised front-of-house recognition protocol, not an abandonment of the lobby standard she had implemented. The reasoning behind it was sound, and she stood by it, but a supplement to it. A structured reference tool for front-of-house staff, updated quarterly, that would include photographs and brief contextual notes on the ownership group, key principals, senior corporate leadership, and any regular high-value guests who were known to arrive informally. Not a display, not a guest book left out for guests to see. A functional, confidential working document for the people responsible for first contact, so that the information gap that had opened up the previous afternoon could not open again. She had included in the proposal a suggested rollout framework, a maintenance schedule, and a note that the tool's value would increase proportionally as it was implemented consistently across multiple properties rather than at a single location. Daniel read it. He was quiet for longer than the situation probably required. "Claudia," he said, "this is good. This is genuinely good work." "It's the minimum," she said. "This should have existed already." "It should have," he agreed. "Send it to Marcus's office with a note. He'll want to see it." She sent it that afternoon with a brief note that described the proposal's intent and its relationship to the previous day's gap. The response came back in under an hour, which she had not expected. It was 3 sentences. He thought the proposal was well considered and practical. He was forwarding it to his operations team to evaluate for rollout across all Alderton properties. He was looking forward to seeing how Lyndon developed the spring menu and would be in Chicago again in 3 weeks. That was it. Clean. Forward-facing. Final. No re-examination of the lobby. No elaborated forgiveness. No reminder of the debt the forgiveness had created. No performance of the magnanimity she had already been shown and that had already been completely and sincerely meant. Just the next thing. She filed the response, sat for a moment with her hands flat on her desk, and then got up and went back to work. Marcus Alderton flew back to Phoenix that same afternoon. The gate was crowded. He found a seat near the window with a view of the tarmac in the gray February light and opened his laptop and went back to the contractor document he'd been reading before the Chicago trip. The dispute had produced 2 new pages of position statements that required the same careful attention he'd been giving it for weeks. He read them. He made notes. He drafted 2 paragraphs of response language that were precise and fair, and that would, he was reasonably certain, move the conversation in the direction it needed to go. He thought about the Alderton, Chicago. He thought about the lobby in the late afternoon, the light on those floors, the way the space felt when it was running well, and it was running well. He thought about a woman who had made a mistake and then, in the space of a single evening, had converted it into something useful, had taken the exact gap that had produced the mistake and turned it into a structured solution. He thought about Daniel, who ran a good operation and hired good people, and who had on this occasion made an understandable briefing error that would not happen again. He thought about Priya and the citrus adjustment and the way she'd looked when he'd told her it was right. He thought, as he sometimes did in airports, about the floors. The original floors of the Alderton, Chicago, the ones he had refinished himself in the spring of 2003 on his knees with a rented sander, working through a weekend because the contractor, quote, was 40% more than he had, and his own labor was the only resource he could fully afford. He had refinished those floors and stood up afterward, his back aching and his hands rough, and looked at what he'd done and thought, "This is real. This is actually going to be a thing that exists." That thought had been, in some ways, the foundation of everything that had come after. The building that had started as 30 rooms in a struggling neighborhood was now 140 rooms with a Michelin kitchen and a waiting list and a staff that received people the way it was supposed to, with warmth, with attention, with a genuine willingness to be present to whoever came through the door. He had built that. Not alone. He was under no illusion about that, but he had been there at the beginning, on his knees with a sander, and he had not let the hard moments convince him to walk away. He thought about the revolving door, the cold outside and the warm inside, and the particular quality of a lobby that receives people the way it's supposed to. Not with the taxonomy of worthiness that people impose when they decide that surfaces are sufficient information. Not with the cold efficiency of a policy applied before the person standing before you has been seen. Just warmth. Just the reliable, unglamorous daily commitment to making whoever comes through the door feel that the place is glad they arrived. He had built that lobby to be warm. He had specified the lighting temperature and the materials and the furniture arrangement. With that intention, years before he had the money to fully realize it, years before anyone who walked in would have been able to tell from the outside that this was a place worth entering. Warm first, everything else second, it still was. Even today, when today had been exactly what it had been, the lobby of the Alderton Chicago was warm. His coat had been too thin for the February wind, and he had walked back out into it without complaint, and the lobby had been there when he'd come back in, running the way it was supposed to run, warm. The way it was supposed to be warm. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Before we close out tonight, I want to ask you something I genuinely want you to answer in the comments because I think it's the real question this story is sitting on. Have you ever been the person in that lobby? Not figuratively, specifically. Have you ever walked into a space and been looked at, assessed in 3 seconds, and redirected by someone who had made up their mind before you'd said a word, who saw the surface and stopped there and missed everything underneath? Because I think most of us have that story somewhere. Most of us have a version of the lobby moment, the meeting where no one asked our opinion, the interview where we could see the decision being made before we'd finished our first sentence, the room where we were the wrong thing on the wrong day, according to someone who was very confident they knew what the wrong thing looked like. And the question Marcus sat with for 20 minutes in that chair by the window, without any visible anger, without any performance of patience. The question is always the same. What do you do with that moment? What do you choose to do with the moment when someone has looked at you and gotten you completely wrong? Marcus Alderton did not use the moment for theater. He did not wait for the dramatic reveal and take his satisfaction from it in the open, the way so many of us would have been tempted to do. He sat down, watched his lobby run, and used what he'd observed to have an honest conversation at dinner that ended with 3 people raising their glasses and a protocol that would eventually be implemented across 11 properties. He turned the moment of being dismissed into an occasion to demonstrate what leadership actually looks like when it doesn't need an audience. He turned being asked to leave his own building into a lesson his entire organization would benefit from. That is not patience as passivity. That is patience as strategy. That is character, doing what character does when it's actually real and not performed. It simply continues, and the work gets better, and the people around it become better because of it. Claudia Voss walked away from that dinner, a different professional than the one who had applied her policy in the lobby at 10 minutes past 4. Not a diminished one. Not a person carrying the weight of a humiliation. She was told to be grateful she'd survive. A better one because she had encountered someone who met her mistake with context rather than punishment, who looked at a human error and asked what was missing in the system rather than what was wrong with the person, and who had given her, without ceremony or condition, exactly the thing she needed to do the right thing next. That is how people change. Not through the extended experience of consequences, though consequences have their place. Through the encounter with someone who sees clearly, responds generously, and gives you, in the space of a single dinner, a better version of yourself to live up to. And Marcus Alderton sat in an airport gate in the gray Chicago afternoon, reading a contractor document, thinking about floors he had refinished with his own hands 22 years ago, finding in that thought the same quiet satisfaction he had been finding in it for 2 decades. The kind of satisfaction that doesn't require an audience. The kind that is entirely, sufficiently its own. That story stayed with me. I hope it stays with you. If it did, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. And we mean that. Subscribe if you haven't yet, because we're here every week with exactly this kind of story, and we don't plan to stop. And leave us a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us your lobby moment. Tell us about the time someone made a judgment about you before you'd had the chance to show them who you actually were and what you decided to do with that. I read every comment, every single one. Take care of each other out there. We'll see you in the next one.